Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. I just got this device in the mail a few hours ago, so we're going to do a quick preview right here. But as you can imagine, even a quick preview video for me is going to go pretty far in depth. So really, I'm just kind of hoping to keep this under 20 minutes. Either way, this is the Anbernic RG35XX. And that name's a little bit weird. It almost sounds like it's supposed to be a placeholder instead of the actual device name. Either way, that's what we're going to work with here today. This is a budget-friendly device, comes in at around $55. And as you can imagine, with a lower price point like that, this is not a very powerful handheld either. In fact, the operating system is set up to only be able to play PlayStation 1 and below. Now, this device is running a closed-source Linux-based operating system, and it actually functions a lot like the original Miyoo Mini firmware did as well. And there are quite a few parallels between the Miyoo Mini and this one here, especially when it comes to the software. If you ever watched my original Miyoo Mini review, I wasn't so hot on that device. I found that the firmware really held it back. But then once we had custom operating systems available, the whole world kind of opened up for that device. And so the experience with the RG35XX is very similar. We have a device that has some pretty good hardware, but is limited by its software. And so that's what we'll focus on mostly in this preview here, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, to start, there are three different color models here. I have the transparent white one for review, but there's also a transparent purple as well as a gray model that's kind of like a DMG friendly color as well. Now for the first 48 hours, they have an introductory price of $50, but after that it's going to go up $6 to $56 altogether. And each model comes standard with a 64GB SD card loaded up with games. If you'd like, you can pay a little bit extra to get an additional game card as well. In terms of specs, like I mentioned, this is a low powered device. So other than the really nice 3.5-inch screen with a 640 by 480 resolution, we're looking at something that's a little bit more powerful than the Miyoo Mini, but not by much. We have a quad-core CPU and 256 megabytes of RAM. It also contains a 2100 mAh battery. It's supposed to give you about 5 hours of battery life. Now, one thing that people were confused about is that it said it supported a wireless gamepad, and they thought that meant maybe Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. But really, all they're saying right here is that if you plugged in a wireless dongle into the device, it would work. And so no, this device does not have Bluetooth nor Wi-Fi, but it does have HDMI output if you wanted to connect this to a TV. Now going through the quick unboxing here, this is a standard Anbernic box. It comes with a quick manual, a screen protector, and then a charging cable as well. And so big reveal, here's the device here. First impressions, I like the fact that they used a white PCB here, and it really complements the clear transparent case as well. And so yeah, I'm glad that they sent this color over to me for the review unit, because I think it's the one that looks the best. Now I'm not expecting a lot of surprises when it comes to the hardware, but let's do a quick test here. We'll start with the D-pad. And this D-pad is very typical of the Anbernic style. It has a rubber membrane connection and is a little bit bouncy as well. I will say it's a little bit stiffer than I was expecting. We'll get more into that later. The menu, start, and select buttons all have a rubber membrane connection as well, and these are hard plastic buttons too. Now the face buttons are actually a little bit unique. They have a rubber membrane connection too. They feel really nice, but they have a glossy texture to them. And I don't remember seeing glossy buttons on an Anbernic device for several years now, so that's pretty cool. Also on the front here is a single mono speaker placed exactly where it was on the original Game Boy. On the left side, we have a volume rocker for up and down, and then on the top we have a single mini HDMI port. On the right side we have a power and reset button and then two SD card slots. The first one holds that 64GB card, which includes games, but you could add an additional card for more games here. And then on the bottom we have a charging and OTG port as well as a headphone jack. Now looking at the back here, we have 4 different shoulder trigger buttons. These are very similar to other devices Anbernic has released before. Also one note here, if you get a transparent shell, you will see the adhesive here for the battery. And overall, I'm not a big fan of being able to see this gunk like this right here, but your mileage may vary. So now let's get back to those shoulders and triggers. These have a bit of a ski slope to them, and they have a soft clickiness to them as well. This is the same setup we saw in the last vertical device from Anbernic called the RG353V. One thing I like to test on my vertical handhelds is a shake test. Let's have a listen here. And so yeah, there's a bit of a rattle, and that comes from the shoulders and triggers right here. In terms of holding the device and playing it, it is relatively comfortable. I personally think that vertical handhelds are a little bit cramped feeling when you hold them, but overall I think this width is pretty good. Either way, overall I would say this is a comfortable experience, albeit a little bit cramped just by virtue of being a vertical handheld. Now when it comes to ergonomics, what I typically will do is just rest my index fingers on the back ski slopes here. And in all honesty, you're probably not going to use many of these back buttons anyway. You might use the L1 and R1 for Super Nintendo games, and maybe the triggers for some PlayStation games. Now initially this device was being promoted as what they were calling an Anbernic Mini, and while it is relatively small and easy to hold in one hand, it's not what I would call mini or micro. And so let's take a few minutes to do some size comparisons against similar devices. We'll start with the Anbernic RG353V, which came out a few months ago. Now obviously the new one is not as tall as the RG353V. It really just kind of feels like the same device but with no analog sticks. You can see up top it has a very similar model, same thing with here on the back. And so in the end, I would say this is probably one of the closest examples between the two. They even have the exact same screen size and resolution. For all I know, it might actually be the same screen. Now, if you compare to the previous vertical handheld from Anbernic, the RG351V, you can see that yes, it is quite a bit smaller than that one. And going back even further, here's the original Game Boy in a custom shell, and as you can see here, yeah, much smaller than that too. It's also quite a bit smaller than this custom-made Game Boy Color as well. I had a friend who put together both of these for me, and he did a fantastic job. One device that is of similar size is a recent Powkiddy release. This is the RGB20S. But really, the one that everyone's asking about is its comparison against the Miyoo Mini. And as you can see here, they are vastly different in size. The Miyoo Mini has a 2.8-inch screen compared to the 3.5-inch on the other, and I would say altogether it's probably 30% smaller than the RG35XX. Now this device is something I would call a mini device. You could play it with one hand, absolutely no problem, and it fits in any pocket. Meanwhile, I would just say the 350XX is a smallish handheld. But there are some good things about being a little bit bigger. For example, it is quite a bit more comfortable to play than on the Miyoo Mini. The Miyoo Mini is amazing for its size, but it can feel quite cramped. Now, Anbernic is no stranger to making smaller devices. This here is the 280V. This came out a couple years ago. This one has the same screen size as the Miyoo Mini, but it's a little bit shorter and fatter. And before I got the Miyoo Mini, this was my favorite small handheld by far. One thing I really liked about this one is that by having the shoulder buttons on the top, it was very pocketable as well. But that being said, the gameplay itself was pretty cramped too. And while the new one was being called the Anbernic Mini, I was hoping it would be about this size, but it is quite a bit bigger. And finally, another Anbernic device that is of similar size is this one here. This is the RG300. Now this is a very old device that came out even before I started making videos. But as you can see, it has a very similar shape and size to the 350XX, and it's the only other Anbernic device I own that has glossy buttons. Overall, I would say the RG300 is a little bit thinner and taller than the 350XX, but not by much. Okay, that's it for size comparisons. Let's talk about the software experience. Now, by virtue of being a closed-source Linux operating system, it does feel relatively unbaked. There's some little things that are kind of annoying to me. For example, all of the buttons make a sound when you move it around, including the volume button itself. Now luckily, if you go into the settings, there is an option to change that. It's under button sound, and then you can turn it from open to closed. And that's another hallmark of these Chinese-based operating systems. The translations here are pretty poorly done. Even something as simple as on and off is mistranslated. Now within the settings menu, there are a few things we can change. For example, we can set the date and time, and there's also a function within here that you can test all of your buttons to make sure they're working properly. In addition, there are some minor things you can do to adjust the theme. For example, you can change out the icons. I personally like these ones the best. And you can change out the background pattern as well. There's also a few other minor options like changing the language or resetting the factory defaults. Another thing you can do is adjust the screen brightness. You have 5 different modes right here. And so let's take a look at the dimmest setting in the dark. And I would say it looks pretty good here. The light bleed is kind of minor other than the LED here on the top. And so I think it would be possible to comfortably play this one in the dark. Okay, so here we are with my changed out icons, and I gave it a black background. You've got a couple different functions here, like searching or going through your history, or even making a favorites menu. If you go into the main menu here, you can see a list of different systems, all the classic ones all the way up to PS1. But again, that poor translation thing comes into play here. For example, for Final Burn Alpha games, they called it FB Hack Game. And while technically I can deduce that that means Final Burn Alpha, I just wish it was named a little bit more conventionally. Now when it comes to customizing this, for example, changing out the images here or the names of each of these folders, there's no option, at least now, within the stock firmware. And so, truth be told, the navigation experience is a little bit ugly overall. And unfortunately, this is a pretty typical experience when it comes to budget-priced handhelds. So let's keep going with our testing. Let's do an audio test next. And so I'd say the sound here is pretty good. It lacks bass, but it has some nice clarity. Now, while the game is playing, you can press the menu button to bring up a quick menu. And there are some options here, but they are relatively limited. You can make a save state and then load that save state, and you can also restart the game if you'd like. There are some shaders or filters that you can apply. These are called video display effects. And I'll do a test of these here in a minute. You can also adjust the screen brightness, and for the devices that support them, you can change out which BIOS to use as well as turn on rumble. While we're on PlayStation 1, let's talk a little bit about gameplay. One nice thing here is that the chip seems to be just powerful enough to be able to play every PS1 game with no issue. And so in particular, if you're looking for a small PlayStation 1 handheld, this might do really well. But bear in mind that the stock firmware does not support certain file types. For example, CHD files are not recognized by the firmware. And as a point of clarification, yes, this device will support Rumble, but not many games will actually have it. There's going to be some PS1 games and maybe a few Game Boy Advance games that might have that support as well. But other than that, none of the other systems will even have that really as an option. Okay, next let's take a look at Game Boy Advance. First thing you're going to notice here is that the aspect ratio has been stretched from 3:2 to 4:3. And this is always a pet peeve of mine, and unfortunately there is no option within the quick menu to make this adjustment to the actual aspect ratio. So if you want to play Game Boy Advance games, you will have to play them stretched, at least on the stock firmware. So now let's talk about the shaders and filters. The scanline is the first one we're going to show off, and this one kind of looks like a CRT filter, so it looks pretty good with things like NES or Super Nintendo. The main one is actually just called Fast, and this is the one that doesn't have any sort of adjustments to the image. And then we also have one called Dot Matrix, which gives it an LCD grid type display. It's very subtle, but it'll work really well with handheld systems like Game Boy or Game Boy Advance. And then we have one called HD. This is basically a scale filter or shader. What that means is it's going to kind of round out those pixels to give them a bit of a cartoony feel. And I think on a smaller screen like this, you probably won't really notice it anyway, and it doesn't look half bad. But if you are a pixel purist, you're going to want to use the fast preset instead. Now, one thing to note here is each of these filters are a global change. And so if you have it set to fast or grid on one specific game, any other game that you go into after that will retain that same filter as well. And so if you wanted to have a grid display when it came to Game Boy games, but then a scanline one for NES, you would actually have to go and change that manually every single time you switch systems. Now, there are some other limitations with this stock firmware. For example, with Game Boy games, you do not have any sort of colorization options. And so the only thing you can do here is play games in black and white. And additionally, these games are also stretched to 4:3 when they should be the original 10:9 aspect ratio instead. Not that big of a deal, but if you really want to have that original experience, this is not going to give it. There's also a weird thing happening with the games that are preloaded on here. Many of the Game Boy Color games actually would show up in black and white. And there wasn't really any rhyme or reason because some of them would show up in color too. And again, there's no setting within the quick menu to adjust these color options either. Now, when it came to NES games, they seem to run relatively well. But for these systems, there are some scaling issues that you unfortunately cannot address within the stock firmware. For example, here you can see there is pixel distortion with Mega Man's life bar, and unfortunately without any scaling issues or bilinear filtering or anything else like that, you cannot make any adjustments to this image. One other thing to note is the 64GB card that comes with this device is loaded up with games. However, there are several issues with the games list that they're using that are very typical with these Chinese handhelds. For example, there's not a single Mario game on this device at all. So no Super Mario Bros., Super Mario Land, or even Super Mario World games are here on the device. And many of the games that come with it actually are a hacked up version of the original. For example, with Contra, every time you die and come back to life, you're going to have the spread gun instead of just your regular gun. And you might see that as an actual bonus because it makes the game easier, but unfortunately it's not a very original experience. And for a device that's supposed to be recapturing those nostalgic feelings, it can be a bit of a disappointment. Another thing I noticed is that some of the games run a little bit too fast, especially with Nintendo and Super Nintendo games. Take a listen here to the music from Mega Man X. If you're familiar with it, you'll see that it is way too fast. And additionally, with Super Nintendo, we have those same scaling issues that we had with the original Nintendo as well. And so overall, I would say the Super Nintendo experience, at least out of the box, is quite compromised. Not only can we not adjust the pixel balance here to give us better scaling, but there also seems to be some speed issues with some of these games. My guess here is that they used PAL-based ROMs which run at 50 Hz, but then they set that emulator to run at 60 frames per second instead. And so because of that, we're getting a slight speed increase when we play these games. I also found that some of these side-scrolling games had some weird visual elements to them. It's almost like the background would not scroll completely smoothly. And I'm not sure if that's because it's speeding up real quick or if it's pausing, but either way it doesn't have a very smooth experience. And I'm hoping this comes through on the video right here, but it was especially apparent here with Sonic the Hedgehog. Now, these are all issues when it comes to the software side, but there are a couple things with the hardware that are also kind of nitpicky too. For example, throwing fireballs or dragon punches in Street Fighter was not as easy as I was hoping it would be. When it comes down to it, I think the D-pad is just a little bit more stiff than I was hoping. And I think the stiffness works really well when it comes to platformers, but when it comes to fighting games, it's just a little bit hard to throw those diagonals. Now, generally, as you start to play these devices more and more, the rubber membrane will loosen up over time. And so this may just be one of the quirks that happens in those first few hours of gameplay. Either way, I missed enough Hadoukens and Shoryukens that I wanted to bring it to your attention as well. But I will say from a performance standpoint, these arcade games, especially things like CPS2 and Neo Geo, played really well. And one other practical observation is there is a sleep function on this device. If you tap the power button, it will go to sleep. It'll keep the LED light on, but it will turn off the display and the buttons. Because I've only had this device for a few hours, I'm not sure what the battery drain is going to be like. That's going to take some more testing. But at the very least, if you want to close out of a game and then come right back to it, you can tap the power button and it'll work. Now, unfortunately, you cannot hold down on the power button to power off the device. What you have to do is go into the settings and do that there. And unfortunately, this is not a very intuitive experience like it is on other handhelds. What you have to do here is navigate over to the settings, then scroll down to shutdown, and then select yes, and then goodbye. So it will take a little bit of an effort to properly shut down the device. So now let's take a look at the generic 64GB SD card that comes with the device. Now the card itself is actually split into 4 different partitions. The first partition here has a couple of the boot files as well as some logo images as well. And so at the surface level, at the very least, we'll be able to go in and change the boot logo for this device. Now 2 of the other partitions are actually Linux-based partitions, and so they might actually have some information here, including the emulators and things like that. And so I'm hoping the community developers will be able to get in there and crack that open. And then the last partition actually has all the ROMs. They're going to be organized by different systems, and you can go in here and see them. And it looks like you can also add the box art here as long as you name it the same as the file. And so next what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a couple Mario games to the system and see how those play as well. But this even presented its own problems. For example, if we go into the Super Nintendo folder, I could not find the games at all. They actually have 1,500 different games and ROM hacks here loaded up on the card, but among all of them, I could not find my new games. Typically what will happen in this scenario is you'll go into the settings and then there'll be an option here to refresh the ROMs list. But unfortunately within here, there is no setting for that. In the end, the only way that I could actually find my Mario games was to actually search for the word Mario and find them there. And so I did spend a few minutes playing Super Mario World 2, one of the hardest games to emulate on the Super Nintendo. And I will say, during my gameplay, there weren't any slowdowns. But I will say the overall gameplay experience was not very smooth. It reminded me a lot of Sonic the Hedgehog in that the background didn't scroll very well, and it just felt like there was a little bit of speed up here and there as well. If I had to guess, I would say it's using a frame skip with the Super Nintendo emulator, and that's what's causing this experience. And so yes, it'll even play all of the hard to emulate Super Nintendo games, but the experience isn't as good as I was hoping it would be. Okay, so those were my quick impressions of the device. Let's round this up and talk about what I like and what I don't like, at least here in the first few hours. In terms of what I like, I think the device overall comes together fairly well. It looks nice, it has solid buttons, and the screen is decent as well. All that together in a single package for a price of about $56 is pretty awesome. I also like that it is relatively small. I would call this a pocketable or small device, but I would not call it a mini one. To me, that title is reserved for devices like the Miyoo Mini or the RG280V. In terms of what I don't like, one of the things I would have loved to have seen is a Wi-Fi chip on this device. It would have been really cool to be able to play all of these lower end systems, but with retro achievements as well. Now that probably would have bumped up the price by a couple dollars, but I think it would have been totally worth it. And finally, the main thing I don't like about this device is the stock firmware. In fact, I find that it degrades the entire experience of the whole device. It seems to me like every single emulator has at least one issue that cannot be changed within the settings. And unfortunately, given the fact that this is a closed source operating system, I'm a little bit worried that we may not have a solution in the future either. Now that being said, I know there are some community developers who are interested in working on this device, but even then, because they don't actually have access to these sources, it's going to be kind of a hack job to make it work. Now, a shining example within the community is the Miyoo Mini. Even without having any sort of sources, the community was able to make multiple different operating systems that are really excellent for that device. And so in the end, I think it would be super awesome if the community did make some solutions for this device. But all the same, much like with the original release of the Miyoo Mini, I am disappointed with the current stock operating system options we have. And so, just based on my initial impressions here, if you're asking me whether or not you think this device is going to be worth the price tag, I'm a little bit torn. If you're the kind of person who's looking for a device that is already loaded up with games and you don't really care about things like colorization or scaling issues, then yes, I think for this price you're getting a pretty good experience, especially if you know what you're getting into. Just bear in mind that you won't have every single one of those games that you want on that SD card, and even then some of those games may not play as smoothly as you remember them back in the day. Now for anybody else who's like me, who is also kind of a stickler when it comes to things like aspect ratio and scaling, then this may not be a good fit, at least right now. For me, I found that all the software issues did prevent me from fully enjoying the device. And so it may be a couple months down the line we have a much better software experience, and if we do, I will totally make a video about it then. But as it stands right now, I walked away from this device a little bit disappointed. And if based on the things that I found in this video you think you would be too, then it might be worth your time to just wait and see. Anyway, that's it for my impressions right now. I'm gonna wait a little bit before I do my full review. But let me know what you think about all this in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.